All right. Well, thank you everyone for sticking around for the second talk today. Today I'll be presenting our work on analogy across modality, evidence for analogical similarity across sensory modalities and identification of a general analogy factor. So I'm going to be presenting results from a series of studies looking at distant forms of analogical reasoning that involve multiple kinds of modalities. So I'll begin with a brief introduction of what I mean by distant analogical reasoning before providing a general overview of the methods in our primary research questions. And then I'll move fairly quickly through 3 studies examining cross-modality reasoning before ending with some conclusions. Okay. So our lab at Georgetown is largely interested in distant analogical reasoning. And by distant, I mean reasoning involving abstract similarities between concepts or experiences that are different on the surface. We consider this kind of distant analogical reasoning to be a form of creativity, with more distant connections being viewed as more creative. For instance, we like to cite kind of the frequently described example of creative scientific analogy of Bohr's model of the atom being analogous to the solar system. Now, in the past, we have focused primarily on distant analogies in the verbal modality. Most frequently, we look at proportional analogies, and by proportional analogies, I mean the analogy kind we're all familiar with, which is A is to B as C is to D. So for instance, if you were presented with the analogs kitten is to cat, one could form a number of valid analogies. For instance, puppy is to dog. But this wouldn't be a very distant or creative analogy because kittens, cats, puppies, and dogs are all closely related concepts. A more distant analogy would be something like kitten is to cat as dollar is to fortune, or spark is to fire. In all 3 cases here, there is, of course, a shared relational match, which can be described as essentially A can grow into B. But the distance is greater for the latter 2 examples because they do not share superficial similarity with kitten or cat. For verbal analogies, this concept of distance can be quantified through semantic analysis, which is something that I imagine many of you are familiar with. Without getting into too much of the details, semantic analysis indicates the semantic relatedness between words, for instance, by examining how frequently those words co-occur in various text documents. In this way, it's a pretty intuitive concept with words that are commonly associated with each other, showing less semantic distance. Now, there are a number of ways to measure semantic distance, but if you use a recently developed tool known as SEMDIS, you'll see that indeed, puppy to dog is closer in semantic distance over here to kitten cat relative to dollar to fortune and spark to fire. So even though all 3 of these valid analogies share a relational structure, the surface similarities are different. That is, there's greater surface dissimilarity between kitten and cat and spark and fire. But despite this surface dissimilarity, one is still able to understand that these are all valid analogies. But it's important to note that despite that dissimilarity or increased semantic distance, by at least one feature, there is actually not any dissimilarity between these analogies. And that feature is that they're all words. So from this perspective, you could think of the most semantically distant analogies you want. But if the point is to either identify other valid analogies or form your own, you're still operating within just one kind of modality. And by that, I mean goodness. Oh my gosh. Okay. And by that, I mean your brain is processing language and then forming associations using shared sensory and information pathways. Now, my mouse is disappearing. Here we go. Okay. By contrast, real-world experiences present multiple simultaneous stimulus modalities. For example, words, sounds, objects, tastes. And these things are received via distinct sensory and information processing pathways. So if we really want to study distant proportional analogical reasoning, there's a need then to consider analogies that span multiple modalities. So for the studies I'm about to present, we looked at a qualitatively different kind of distance then. Rather than distance based on semantics or meaning, we focused instead on distance based on information processing modality. And herein was the first objective of this research project, namely, can analogical mapping transcend modality? That is, are individuals able to understand proportional analogies when stimuli do not share any surface similarity because they are in different modalities and processed via distinct neurocognitive streams? Now, in investigating this central question, we were also able to explore a second fairly long-standing topic of inquiry within the field of analogy, and that is there an underlying analogical ability factor that is modality general? In other words, do people have a general analogical ability, which we refer to as Analo-g, playing off, of course, G or general intelligence? And can this predict performance on different kinds of analogical reasoning tasks, regardless of the information processing modality? And relatedly, if analogy does exist, what predicts it? So what other domains of cognition support this modality general analogical ability? Now, prior theoretical and empirical work has offered some answers to these questions. So for example, inherent in some of the main ideas of Gentner's structure mapping theory is the notion that reasoners use language to categorize stimuli and identify relational structures, even for nonverbal stimuli. So verbal abilities then are probably going to be important for this ability. There's also a variety of theories of mental modeling, including those from Philip Johnson Laird and Gentner and others, that suggest that modality-general reasoning relies on visual spatial resources to arrange and compare mental representations. So together, these two accounts suggest that both verbal and visual spatial abilities are likely to support this modality-general analogical reasoning ability, provided that it does exist. So to recap then, this project aimed to answer two primary questions. Can analogical mapping transcend modality? And is there an underlying analogical ability factor that is modality general? And related to this second question, we also want to know, if it does exist, what predicts it? Okay, so for this task, we developed 5 types of analogy stimuli, 2 of which were what we were calling within modality types. So analogies involving lines, that would be line to line, and then also words, which I presented an example of that before. We also developed 3 cross-modality types. So these are analogies going from lines to sounds, lines to words, and words to sounds. To be a little bit more concrete, we then asked participants to judge each analogy as either true or false, and they were all of the form A is to B, as C is to D. So let's just look at some examples of each one of these analogy types to be a little bit more concrete. So starting with the within modality analogies, here's an example of a word-to-word analogy. Nose is to scent as antenna is to signal. This analogy is, of course, true. A nose can detect a scent in the same way that an antenna detects a signal. And here would be another example that is false. Foundation to house, duplex to renter. There are surface similarities here, houses, buildings, etc., but there isn't a shared relational structure. Okay, so now here are the line-to-line examples. This is again within modality. We're only looking at lines here. And this one, as you can tell, is true. This is a pretty easy example. The lines are getting closer in A and B, much in the same way that they are in C and D. In this example, however, there isn't a relational match. There's no clear reason why what's happening in A and B is translated to C and D. So now let's look at some of these cross-modality analogies that we developed. So first, we have line to word. So I'll give you a minute to look at this one. So this is a true analogy, right? The lines are of equal length in A, but then unbalanced in B. And that is a shared relationship as what we're seeing between something being fair and unfair. And here's a false example. There's not a clear connection between A and B and C and D. Okay, so now we're going to look at some line to sound analogies, and I believe the sound should work. You can, I learned you can share, when you share screen, you can share your audio too. So here we have A is to B as is to, so the pitch of the two notes bend up and down, just like the two lines are angled up and then down. Just another example here. A is to B as is to, so that wouldn't be, there's no match there. So that would be a false example. And lastly, we have the word to sound analogies. So indecision is to certainty as is to. So in this case, the alternating notes in C and D reflect the structure of certainty and uncertainty. So that would be a true analogy. And just one more example here. Gang is to leader as is to. And for this one, there's not a clear relational match there. So that would be false. Okay. So turning now to these studies, I'll start, of course, with study 1. So we used 2 small independent samples, one in person, one online, for an initial proof of concept. Basically, we were unaware of any work that had explored this kind of specific question. So we wanted to just demonstrate that people were able to do these problems accurately. So all participants completed 45 to 50 trials for each analogy type, with the exception of the word to sound analogies, which were only completed in the online sample. And as I said, we're really just asking if these cross-modality analogies could be understood. In other words, do people perform better than chance? Right. Okay, so here are the results. In each of these plots, each dot indicates the accuracy of an individual participant. And as we can see in both samples, participants performed well on this task and far above chance, which would of course be 50%. And we see high accuracy for the 2 within modality analogy types, line, line, and word, word. But what's most exciting is that we also see high accuracy scores for the cross-modality analogies, line to sound, line to word, and word to sound. So these findings provide fairly clear evidence that people are able to reason across processing modality. One important thing to note here is that upon closer inspection, it's clear that several participants were performing near ceiling on these analogies. And we can see that in the clustering of dots at or near 100% accuracy. So to help deal with these ceiling effects, we also assess performance using a measure of signal detection, D prime. For those of you unfamiliar, this measure allows us to try to separate noise from signal by essentially penalizing people for false alarms. So incorrectly reporting a false analogy as true and rewarding them for their hit rate, which would be correctly identifying true analogies as true. So when we plot the results using D prime, you can see that this was indeed effective at reducing ceiling effects, effectively creating a wider range of scores, especially in the online sample. But it's important to note that these scores are still greater than chance, which in this case would be 0. And that's the case in both samples. So regardless of scoring method, then results from study 1 provided proof of concept that analogical similarity can be mapped across information modalities. So this brings me to study 2. So having established that analogy across modality is possible, we next turn to our second primary question, and that is performance across the analogy types explained by a modality-general ability factor? In other words, is analogical reasoning ability independent of modality? So do people who perform well on one modality perform well on the others? And if this factor exists, then what predicts it? By that, I mean, what other cognitive abilities are associated with the modality-general ability? So to address these questions, we recruited a larger sample of participants and had them complete all 5 analogy types included in study 1, again with 45 to 50 trials per type. To explore associations between this possible modality-general ability and other cognitive factors, participants also completed a mental rotation task to assess spatial ability and the MAB to assess verbal ability. it's probably worth noting, of course, that these are rudimentary measures of the resources supporting spatial and verbal abilities, so they wouldn't be fully encapsulated by what we measured here. Also, as I noted earlier, there's a fairly extensive collection of theoretical and empirical work demonstrating associations between spatial and verbal abilities and analogical reasoning. So we collected these estimates to look at whether they were associated with performance across the different analogy modalities and this factor, should it exist. Okay. So first, we again observe strong performance across each of the analogy types. D prime scores are displayed here, but accuracy was high as well, and the interpretation of the results really aren't that different if we look at accuracy. So this is just a clear replication of what we saw in the first study, but with a larger sample. Okay, so now let's turn to that second question of whether performance was explained by an underlying modality-general factor. So to answer this question, we first looked at just the correlations across the different analogy types. And as we can see here, performance was strongly correlated within participant. Almost all of these R values are greater than 0.5, demonstrating that individuals who performed well on one kind of analogy tended to perform well on the rest. Next, we conducted a principal component analysis of scores on the 5 different analogy types. And as indicated here, a single large eigenvalue explained a large portion of the variance across the different types, and that's consistent with a single underlying factor, which again we have termed Analo-g. So together, these two display items indicate that performance on the 5 different analogies was likely related to a single large underlying component, and that this component explained a large percent of variation on each of the 5 tasks. So this does point to a modality-general factor. So having established that this analogy does exist, we examined the extent to which it was associated with verbal and visual spatial abilities. So to do this, we calculated an Analo-g component score for each participant, and then ran a linear regression model in which verbal and visual spatial abilities were entered as predictors. So here's what we found. I'll give you just a moment to look at the table. So these results provide pretty clear evidence that spatial ability, and even more strongly, verbal ability, were significantly associated with Analo-g. Similarly, we also found that performance across the analogy types remained strongly correlated after controlling for MRT and MAB. So this correlation table indicates partial R values after controlling for those. And we can see kind of across the different analogy types, we still see really strong similarities in performance. All of these are significant at p less than 0.001. Also, the first column indicates that controlling for MRT and MAB doesn't prevent Analo-g from being predictive of each of the individual analogy types as well. So therefore, although Analo-g may draw from verbal and visual spatial abilities, verbal and visual spatial abilities alone do not fully account for performance on these tasks. So just to summarize that second study, we replicated results of study 1 indicating cross-modality proportional analogy. Performance on the different analogy types was explained by Analo-g. And Analo-g was predicted by verbal ability and to a lesser extent visual spatial ability. But, and this was the last point I made on the previous slide, those abilities do not fully account for the shared performance. And that is because performance across the analogy types remained correlated when controlling for MRT and MAB. And Analo-g also remained predictive of performance on each type. Okay, so moving now to our final study. For this one, we wanted to hone in specifically on the cross-modality analogies. Also, because there were the ceiling effects that I described in the first 2 studies, we included a small subset of the most challenging analogies for each type. The idea here was to create a wider range of responses and avoid any sort of padding that may have inflated performance on studies 1 and 2. In addition to cross-modality analogies, we also had people complete Raven's progressive matrices, which, as I imagine most of you know, is a measure of fluid intelligence, which has also been associated with analogical reasoning in past work. So again, our primary questions here for this study were more or less the same as study 2. Does analogy exist? And what's its association, in this case, with fluid intelligence? And we also asked whether performance on the different analogy types would remain correlated and predicted by analogy, again, even after controlling for fluid intelligence. So looking once more at performance, we can see that even when we only focused on the most challenging analogies, accuracy remained high. Note that this table is presenting accuracy rather than D prime, again, because the whole point of this design was to reduce the ceiling effects, and we had a more dynamic range of responses. Again, if we sub out accuracy with D prime, the results and interpretations are more or less the same. So we have this piece of information, and then we again performed a principal component analysis with scores on the different analogy types. And we again found that a single factor analogy explained performance across the 3 different types. So that's kind of a replication of what we saw in study 2. And then we wanted to correlate that factor with Ravens. So when we do that, we find that Analo-g, which is indicated along the x-axis, and the fluid intelligence score, which is just what they got on the Ravens matrices on the y. So we can see here that these 2 things are strongly correlated. So those higher in the underlying modality-independent analogical ability factor scored higher on Ravens progressive matrices. So this seems to suggest that Analo-g, as expected, is associated with fluid intelligence. And finally, much like results looking at visual, spatial, and verbal abilities in study 2, performance on each of the analogy types again remains strongly correlated even after we controlled for fluid intelligence. Again, the section that I have in the box here is the cross-type partial correlations, and those all remain significant. Moreover, once again, Analo-g remains strongly predictive of accuracy for each analogy type. So complementing and extending the study 2 results, we found that individual differences in fluid intelligence did not fully account for variability in analogical reasoning, which again appears to reflect this distinct analogy factor. Okay, so tying this all together, let's think about what we can conclude from this work and where this leads us. So first and foremost, we found that analogical mapping can occur in the absence of any sensory or information-modal similarity. People were able to map information that was initially received via distinct processing streams. We also found that performance across the analogy types was explained by a single modality-independent factor, and that this factor, Analo-g, was supported by visual spatial abilities, verbal abilities, and fluid intelligence. But those abilities did not fully account for the shared performance, and that was because performance remained highly correlated across the different analogy types, even when we controlled for these other abilities. So these findings most strongly support SMT or any other perspectives that make a mention of the importance of verbal abilities in analogical reasoning, but we also found evidence that visual spatial abilities and fluid intelligence seems to be involved as well. So any accounts putting forward those underlying abilities as crucial to analogy certainly were supported by our results as well. And I think most excitingly, this was something that we were unaware of any work that had taken this approach, that had tried to ask about proportional analogies involving different modalities. So now that we've kind of demonstrated that this is possible, we think that this work opens, qualitatively expands inquiry space for new questions about how information is mapped across modality. Okay, I'd just like to thank my collaborators and sponsors, and I saw a number of questions popping up throughout, so I'd be happy to field those now.